Today is part 2 of our sermon series, Women in the Bible, and our focus today is Sarah from the book of Genesis. Listen for how Sarah encounters God. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife, Sarah, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. God said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." The light shines on the place that your eye needs to go. Look at any painting by the famous artist Rembrandt, and your eyes will instantly be drawn to a light source, this sacred aha that Rembrandt wants your eyes to focus on, so that Rembrandt makes almost an artificial light source coming up at that portion of the painting. And Rembrandt's painting of today's passage about Abraham and Sarah is no exception. Rembrandt paints a picture of Abraham sitting on the ground in front of his house, serving supper, placing that fresh baked bread and that steak hot off the grill in front of these 3 guests, pouring them a jug of wine. And the 3 guests in the picture are the ones who are illuminated with light. One of them even has wings, appearing as an angel and shining radiantly to remind us that these are not just random passers-by, but the very presence of God. But where is Abraham's wife Sarah, the one who baked that bread? Sarah stands over there in the background, behind a door, just barely peeking out behind the door, kind of looking over that impromptu dinner party. Now, the Bible mentions a particular female character 344 times. 178 times the woman is given a name, like Sarah or Rebecca or Miriam in the Old Testament, or Martha and Priscilla in the New Testament. But about half the time a woman is mentioned, she isn't even given a name. It's, the woman at the well or the woman with the hemorrhage. Maybe the woman that you would think of most obviously when you think about women in the Bible would be Mary, the mother of Jesus. But it's actually Sarah who gets the most play of all the female characters in the Bible. Sarah is mentioned 59 times, and she is the one who plays the most prominent, pivotal role in our faith story. Sarah and her husband Abraham are the matriarch and the patriarch of our faith. They are our grandparents, our spiritual grandparents, our great-grandparents. Whether we call ourselves Jewish or Christian, we claim them as our matriarch and our patriarch, and they are a really brave, bold pair. Now, if I ask you, remember President Roosevelt? You might quickly think also of Eleanor Roosevelt, because much of his leadership included her bold and brave moves. Yet, when Rembrandt paints Sarah, he puts her not alongside Abraham. He paints her over there in the shadows, in the backdrop, easily overlooked, removed for the main action of God's divine inbreaking. When I looked at Rembrandt's painting of this scene, I had to search to find Sarah. She was so hidden. But before we look at what happens in today's scene from Genesis 18 between Abraham and Sarah and these unexpected visitors, let's first look at what's happened in Sarah's life up to this point. The scriptures make it clear that Sarah is drop-dead gorgeous, and she and Abraham share a long marriage with many ups and downs. Back when they were just newlyweds, God had come to Abraham and promised Abraham that he would have a huge family, descendants more numerous than the stars. But Sarah has encountered two big problems in her life. One is her husband has betrayed her by loaning her out to the Egyptian Pharaoh, who takes advantage of her. Don't you kind of wonder how they patched up their marriage after that scene? And the second is that Sarah can't have kids. She's infertile. Back then they called it barren, which was a farming term. The ground was barren if it could not grow seed, and a woman was barren if she could not have her husband's children. They had no modern sense of biology that told them that both the father and the mother contributed to the creation of the embryo. The woman was simply the container or the incubator. So Sarah goes out and finds a surrogate, a second wife for Abraham named Hagar. And Hagar and Abraham have a son named Ishmael. I cannot imagine how sad that made Sarah. But maybe you can, because there's a way in which women still remain in the backdrop in our modern times. Today, there are 193 countries around the globe, and 13 of them are led by a woman head of state. So far in modern history, 60 countries have had women leaders. We are one of the most advanced societies around the globe, and we have not yet had a woman president. We continue to experience sexual abuse scandals in the highest places reserved for moral and civic leadership, places like church and government. And we continue to live through the cover-ups and the excuses. Sarah stands back behind the door, overhearing the conversation between Abraham, her husband, and the Lord. And then Sarah bursts out laughing. She laughs to herself like a kid in church who gets the giggles but hopes that no one will notice. She laughs spontaneously, cackling to herself at what she hears God tell Abraham, that Sarah in this very year is going to have a baby. Sarah laughs because it has ceased to be with her in the way of women. Her biological clock is no longer ticking. She's well past menopause. She's applied for Social Security, and she's thinking about finding a house without stairs, or maybe moving into one of those communities, one of those retirement communities where someone else will take over most of the cooking. But God announces that the stork is coming, and Sarah will soon be picking out wallpaper for her baby's nursery, and so she laughs. Who wouldn't? It's the craziest thing she has ever heard. And then God says to her, "Why did you laugh?" And she says, "I didn't laugh." And God says, "Did too." It's the only time in the Old Testament that God speaks directly to a woman. And what do they talk about? Laughter. It's such a delightful scene, God announcing this good news, Sarah laughing and then denying the laughter right to God's face. There's so much that I love about this scene. I love Sarah's hospitality, baking bread for these strangers. They put on the most elaborate feast for these strangers. I love Sarah's honesty. "Oh, come on, this is not happening." One scholar calls Abraham and Sarah models of disbelief. We're always holding up biblical characters and saying, look at what a model of faith this person is. But here, Abraham and Sarah are models of disbelief. In a previous scene, if we go back a couple of chapters, we will hear that Abraham learns that Sarah's going to have a baby, and he falls down on his face in laughter. You see, both Abraham and Sarah have accepted that hopelessness is the normal state of affairs. Just get used to it. They are honest. They are realist. Hopelessness is the normal state of affairs. Most of all, I love Sarah's laughter because her laughter reminds me of that thrilling moment when you realize that God can do the wildest thing in the world, and you're going to be involved in it. Many of you read that bestseller, The Women, by Kristen Hanna. For those of you that didn't read it, it's a story about a young woman in the 1960s named Frankie. She's living in Southern California, and she feels called to serve alongside her brother and many of her friends who are being called up to go to Vietnam. She quickly learns the skills that it will take, that goes through the training to become an Army nurse. And she is sent to Vietnam, where she glimpses and experiences the most horrific situations, and then she comes home. The novel points out how difficult it was for our soldiers to come home after experiencing such difficult military experiences and then to not be honored for their service. But the shocking part of this book is that when Frankie comes home after serving round the clock, week after week, month after month, year after year in Vietnam, she comes home and no one believes that she served her country in Vietnam. She goes to apply for a job as a nurse at a hospital, and they say, "Well, what experience do you bring?" And she shows them her service in Vietnam, and they said, "No women served in Vietnam." And then she goes to a veterans group where they're talking about their PTSD, and the men soldiers say to her, "You can't be here." You see, the role of the women in that war was hidden. They were the backdrop. Frankie literally saved lives, but no one, not even her own parents, will acknowledge her military service. Like Sarah, Frankie was painted into the shadows, or maybe left out of the picture altogether. I only learned recently, and maybe you already knew this, a little over 150 years ago in 1872, a woman ran for president in our country. Victoria Woodhull ran for president. She was committed to both suffrage and abolition. She ran on a ticket with Frederick Douglass on a platform that warned Americans not to succumb to authoritarianism from wealthy individuals who capitalize on fear. Yet most of us have never heard of her, or if we have, we don't really know her story. It remains in the shadows of history. I have a vivid memory of the first time anybody ever asked me if I wanted to be a minister. I was in junior high. I don't remember if it was 6th or 7th grade, but I remember the day. Jim Wright was the business administrator of my home church in Fort Worth, Texas, and he was doing some big church mailing, and he needed some of us from the youth group to come up and volunteer to stuff envelopes. So we were sitting there doing that mindless work of stuffing envelopes in Jim Wright's office when he looked across the table at me and said, "Have you ever thought about being a minister, Carla?" I was stunned. Why did he ask me that? I had never given one thought to that subject. Maybe I should have, because Sherry was our youth minister, a woman minister. Maybe I should have at least considered the idea, but at that moment, it had not crossed my mind. But when he asked me that question, I felt seen, not in the shadows, not a kid, not a girl, but a person who had the potential to be the vessel for God's hope, God's love, God's life. I no longer felt background, but foreground. I keep wondering, if God was the painter, where would God shine the light on this scene between Abraham and Sarah and the unexpected visitors who announce that Sarah is about to become a mom? Maybe the light would shine from her holy laughter, because it is her laughter that testifies to God's holy hope unfolding even in those human beings who are so often hidden in the shadows. Maybe Sarah is a metaphor for all of us, both men and women, who often find that we are in the background, and yet when God speaks, we are invited to become God's vessel of new life for the world. The stories of women in the Bible are not stories about women. They are stories about God. And sometimes laughter is all you can do when you have those God moments and you realize that God's life and hope springs forth right in your own midst. I was deeply moved recently by an article written by Wheaton College professor Esau McCauley. He wrote, "Hope is most useful when the evidence runs the other way toward despair." He recalls that Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech took place in our country at a time when we were marred by segregation, an unpopular war in Vietnam, widespread social unrest, including bloody violence even in churches. When King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, "I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history." I loved this reminder to me, maybe you need it too, that hope is only needed when all the evidence points to the contrary. I think that's what Sarah experienced. Hope, true hope, unfolds when all the evidence points to the contrary. I love what the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says about Sarah's story. He compares her hope to the hope of Jesus. You remember how Jesus kneels in the Garden of Gethsemane prior to his arrest and crucifixion, and in the shadow of night, Jesus prays, "Father, remove this cup from me." But God does not remove the cup from Jesus. Jesus suffers agony and defeat and then rises to new life. Throughout Scripture, God refuses to create a future that has no shadows, no pain, no suffering. Instead, God enters into the shadows, and there with us, God shines a light. God offers hope. And so 9 months after this scene from Genesis, Sarah gives birth to her firstborn child, and she cradles her son, and she names him Laughter. She looks at her baby boy and she calls him Isaac, which means laughter.